The true crime genre gives us a chance to delve into the darker side of humanity. As troubling as the subject matter may be, it also offers a strange form of escape. With that in mind, in this compilation we explore several such stories for you to lose yourself in. Our first true crime tale involves a love triangle, jealousy, and murder. Born in 1880, Isabel Patterson grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Described as having exceptional beauty, a woman with soft features, big dark eyes, brown hair, and a flawless figure, Isabel turned heads wherever she went. In 1900, when she was 20 years old, Isabel married a man named John E. Folk and moved to Memphis, Tennessee. John was a shoe salesman who traveled a lot because of his work, but whenever he was back home, he drank heavily and allegedly, both verbally and physically, abused his wife. It was a marriage doomed from the start, and yet the union ended up lasting for 6 years before the two finally separated. Isabel moved back to St. Louis, where she booked a room at the Jefferson Hotel in order to be at the center of the city's social scene. She loved attending parties and social gatherings. She was a natural entertainer who lived for attention. The stylish and charming young woman was soon given the nickname the Butterfly, which fit Isabel's gregarious nature perfectly. There were no doubt many men smitten with her, but it was a wealthy widow named John W. Springer who caught Isabel Patterson's attention. Springer had made a name for himself as a lawyer and banker in Illinois and Texas before moving to Denver, Colorado in 1896. There, John was very prominently involved in the social scene and local affairs thanks to his intelligence and wide variety of interests, from business, law, and politics to ranching cattle and horses. John once ran, although unsuccessfully, for the mayor of Denver and was the president of both the National Livestock Association and the Colorado Cattle and Horse Growers Association. In 1898, he purchased 10,000 acres of land overlooking Denver and built one of the largest cattle ranches in Colorado, Springer Cross Country Horse and Cattle Ranch. He was a very successful man, a man with whom Isabel Patterson knew she could live a very comfortable life. When the two met in the Jefferson Hotel in the summer of 1906, Isabel was still legally married, and John was still healing from the loss of his beloved wife of 13 years, Eliza, who had died of tuberculosis a couple of years earlier. But none of that mattered, nor did the age difference. Isabel was in her mid-20s, while John was 47 years old. From the moment the banker laid his eyes on the young woman for the first time, he was besotted. Only 4 months after Isabel's divorce was finalized, on April 27, 1907, she and John were married in St. Louis. The newlyweds then headed to Denver, where the beautiful bride didn't go unnoticed. The newspaper columnists were swift to write about the new Mrs. Springer. We always thought John W. was pretty fair-looking, but his wife is a stunning beauty, and it is safe to prophesy that the Springer home is going to be a social center. The new Mrs. Springer seemingly wanted for nothing. She and her husband lived in a 7-bedroom mansion at 930 Washington Street when they weren't spending time at the massive Springer Ranch, surrounded by maids, housekeepers, and chauffeurs who took care of their every need. As John W. Springer's wife, Isabel was thrust straight into the highest level of the city's party circuit and was soon on the guest lists for important social functions with all noteworthy Denver society names. But tea and dinner parties with politicians and their wives and trips to the theater were not exactly Isabel's idea of fun. She missed the nightlife, the adventure. John did his best to please her, and even rented a 6th-floor suite in the Brown Palace Hotel in downtown Denver, to make it easier for her to attend nighttime events and entertain her friends. Unbeknownst to John, those friends also included other men who had an eye on his new wife. Perhaps it was Isabel's hunger for attention and excitement that prevented her from completely ending an old fling with a man named Tony von Fool. Just like Isabel, Tony had a restless, adventurous nature. He grew up in St. Louis and was on his way to a promising career in the city's brokerage office. But in the end, a desk job wasn't really Tony's thing. Instead, he learned how to ride, rope, and muster the horse and became a jockey. In his free time, Tony was an aggressive, fearless, and talented hot air balloon and later airplane pilot who didn't hesitate to take risks. Reportedly, the young man escaped death more than once while up in the sky. Thanks to his good looks and reputation as an aeronaut, he was popular among the ladies, whom he often entertained at the Jefferson Hotel. It's unclear when he and Isabel first met, but the two were unsurprisingly magnetically drawn to each other and had had some kind of relationship before John Springer entered the picture. Isabel, getting married and moving to Denver, however, wasn't enough to keep her away from the young adventurer. Despite living over 800 miles away, Isabel often visited St. Louis and met with Tony every now and then, keeping their relationship alive. It says a lot that at the beginning of 1911, 4 years after marrying John, she was still writing letters to the aeronaut, very intimate letters. One from January 31st, 1911 reads as follows: "Dearest love, I can hardly bear to be away from you. I miss you so much. You're the only one I love in the world. Isabel." In other letters, she begged Tony to visit her in Denver, claimed she had never loved anyone else, and expressed her frustration when he didn't write back as speedily as she wished. All this while John often sat in the room next door. As Isabel wrote in April 1911, "My darling, just a little note tonight to let you know your little sweetheart is thinking of you. John is in the next room and likely to come in at any minute, so you know I must hurry. Oh, how I wish you were here tonight to tuck me in my little bed and kiss me goodnight. I have been sick ever since I left St. Louis, and you can't imagine how I have longed for you, sweetheart." Only one of Tony's letters was ever published, but it's an important one, as it indicates that there was some trouble in paradise. It seemed that despite his lover being married to another man, he wasn't happy about someone else, a third party, showing interest in Isabel. On an unknown date, Tony wrote, "If you are too busy to write me a letter, just say so, and I won't expect them. I have not heard from you for 3 days. I leave here about the 23rd for Denver, if my father does not die, but I am afraid the old man is in pretty bad condition, and I'm holding myself in readiness for a quick trip home. The least I expect from you is for you to behave yourself while I am under this terrific strain and have nothing to do with that double-crosser. No, you don't have to take him out to the ranch or have anything to do with him. Just show him where he gets off, or I will." In her letters, Isabel had mentioned a man named Harold Francis Henwood, her husband's friend and business partner, whom she had met in John's office in March 1911. Frank was said to be a well-traveled, sophisticated, and always impeccably dressed, but hot-tempered fellow, a troublemaker, especially when he was drinking. Despite this, he and Isabel quickly became close and began to spend time together at the Springer Ranch with and without John present. What was happening behind the closed doors only they knew for sure, but it seems safe to assume the two were more than just friends. So at the same time that Isabel was writing intimate letters to Tony, making it sound like the adventurer was the only person in the world she cared about, she was entertaining another man, while her husband was either oblivious or chose to overlook his wife's activities. Although Mrs. Springer didn't reveal the extent of her relationship with Frank to Tony, she wrote about her new admirer in the letters. In one, she stated, "Frank is still here and is, of course, still acting naughty." A rather odd thing to say to her lover. Perhaps she wanted to stir up jealousy in her beau, to make him hurry to her. Whatever the reason, it's likely she couldn't have imagined the deadly turn of events that were to unfold. These began on May the 12th, 1911, when, out of the blue, Isabel asked Frank Henwood for a favour. She needed him to retrieve some foolish little letters she had written to Tony von Full. It wasn't just a few notes. She had sent more than 24 letters to the aeronaut, all very sensitive in nature. Frank was told that she had wanted to end her relationship with Tony, who had then threatened to share the intimate letters with her husband unless she resumed their relationship. This revelation would have no doubt ended the Springers' marriage. A week later, on May the 23rd, Isabel met with Frank in her suite at the Brown Palace Hotel and again asked for help to get her letters back. Frank agreed to deal with the issue, but on one condition. Isabel had to write a note telling von Full their relationship was over. Interestingly, despite claiming she wanted nothing to do with Tony anymore, she refused. Not taking no for an answer, Frank then produced a letter in Isabel's name to present to her lover once he arrived in Denver. Later that day, Tony von Full checked in at the Brown Palace Hotel, requesting a room close to the Springers' suite on the 6th floor. Upon signing in, Tony was handed the note supposedly written by Isabel, which read, "This is just to let you know that someone knows a great deal. Therefore, under no circumstances telephone me or try to communicate with me in any way. Everything is finally and absolutely off. And if you wish to save yourself serious trouble with someone and his friends, you will forget that you ever knew me. Personally, my future is of too much consequence, and I'll never risk it. I will send someone to you to have a final talk with you, and you must be guided by what they say. I have been forbidden to see you or hear from you in the future, and I have given my word, which I propose to keep, not to see you again. I have taken this means of letting you know." Tony, who had received a loving telegram from Isabel just 3 days earlier, saying she was going to answer yes to his question, immediately knew the note wasn't written by his lover. At about 4:45 p.m., he was summoned to the hotel's lobby, where he met Frank Henwood, who introduced himself as the person referred to in the letter. The two men agreed to meet in Tony's room at 5:30 to discuss the situation further. Needless to say, the meeting didn't stay civil for long. Frank pleaded with Tony, asking him to return the letters and not to break up Isabel and John's marriage. But he made one big mistake. He referred to the aeronaut as Tony instead of Sylvester, which was von Full's given name. Tony was a name that only friends and those close to the man were allowed to use. Frank didn't have that privilege. Angered, von Full proceeded to slap the man, who was a lot smaller than him, before pulling out a revolver and ordering Frank to get out of his room. The atmosphere in the Brown Palace that night was uncomfortable, to say the least. During dinner, Frank and Tony sneered at each other while Isabel and her husband ate together at a third table. Apparently, John still had no clue what was happening right under his nose. To make a point, Tony even got up and went to chat with the Springers, forcing Isabel to introduce her lover to her husband while her other lover watched. The situation was reaching a boiling point. The following day, on May the 24th, Isabel told Frank to stop trying to get her letters back. She feared things were about to get out of hand. Tony had come to her room the evening before and threatened to fix Frank. But no matter what Isabel said, it was too late. There was no turning back for the two admirers. At about 11:25 p.m. that night, after an evening at a theatre with the Springers, Frank found his way to the wine room of the Brown Palace. Shortly after, Tony walked to the bar and ordered a glass of whiskey and a beer before acknowledging his rival's presence. There are different versions of what happened next, but the two men exchanged words. Tony saying something along the lines of, "I'm going upstairs and I am going to grab that grey-haired son of a bitch by the hair and pull him out of there and show him who is master here." Frank replied, "You can't get that over me." Von Pfuhl then proceeded to hit Frank in the face, knocking him down. Soon after, 5 loud pops rang out in the room. Frank Henwood, a man who had never owned a gun in his life, had pulled out a newly purchased .38 revolver from his hip pocket and emptied the barrel. 2 of the bullets hit the target, Tony von Pfuhl, piercing his right shoulder and left side between his ribs. But 3 others struck 2 utterly innocent bystanders, George Copeland and James Atkinson. After realizing there were no more bullets in the weapon, an elevator operator of the hotel ripped the revolver from Frank's hand, who then walked to the lobby and sat down to wait for the authorities. At first, neither Frank nor Tony revealed the real reason behind the shooting, trying their best to keep Isabel Springer's name out of the ordeal. Tony, however, after realizing the seriousness of the situation, admitted to a priest at St. Luke's Hospital that a woman had come between him and Frank. Before the police could question him further, Tony von Pfuhl succumbed to his injuries at 11:20 a.m. on May the 25th. About a week later, on June the 1st, one of the innocent bystanders, George Copeland, also passed away following an amputation of his left leg. One of the bullets had severed his femoral artery. Frank Henwood now faced 2 murder charges, all because of foolish little letters. But when the trial began, the prosecution shocked everyone by announcing it wasn't seeking murder convictions for both killings, but just for the death of George Copeland. This was a clear attempt to protect the Springers and control the scandal surrounding the case. An attempt that was destined to fail miserably. Half of Denver knew about Isabel Springer's extramarital affairs. Both she and Frank testified during the trial, claiming nothing improper had happened between them. Frank insisted he had only tried to save his good friend John W. Springer's marriage and had shot Tony von Pfuhl in an act of self-defense. The Springers' housekeeper, Cora Carpenter, however, told the courtroom she had seen Isabel and Frank holding each other just a week before the shooting at the ranch, poking big holes in Frank's story and raising doubts about his real motives. It took the jury only 4 hours to find Henwood guilty of second-degree murder on June the 29th, 1911. He was sentenced to life in prison, but only after Frank accused Judge Whitford of being prejudiced in his 30-minute speech at the beginning of the hearing. There may have been some truth behind the allegation, as the judge had wrongly told the jury that they could not find Frank guilty of manslaughter, only murder. Because of this detail, on February the 3rd, 1913, the state Supreme Court reversed the verdict and granted Frank a new trial. During the second trial, John W. Springer, who had read some of the infamous letters found in Tony von Pfuhl's hotel room and filed for divorce the day after the murders, testified about Frank Henwood's character. Surprisingly, the banker had nothing bad to say. According to John, he was a gentleman whose relationship with his now ex-wife had never been inappropriate. But that didn't erase the fact John's friend had killed 2 people, one of whom had nothing to do with the affairs of Isabel Springer. This time, in June 1913, Frank Henwood was found guilty of the first-degree murder of George Copeland and sentenced to death. A third person was about to die because of the love triangle. John Springer, however, didn't accept the decision and appeared before the Board of Pardons, pleading with them to spare his friend's life. "I have spent thousands trying to learn the truth of this matter, and it has not been in vain." Isabel's mother, on her deathbed, sent word to me that Von Pfuhl had threatened in her presence to kill Isabel with a revolver which he pointed at her. Von Pfuhl was holding over my wife's head letters she had written years before. He blackmailed her and was trying to get diamonds and money from her. Instead of coming to me, she went to my friend Henwood, a man I helped and placed where he could earn a living. Some considered John's story about the blackmail absolute piffle, but Governor Elias M. Ammons listened to him. On October the 16th, the governor signed an executive order commuting Frank's sentence from the death penalty to life in prison. In the end, Frank Henwood spent 10 years in Cannon City Penitentiary before he was pardoned in 1922, only to be sent back behind bars shortly after for assaulting a waitress. Without ever seeing freedom again, Frank died in prison in 1929. As for Isabel Springer, she didn't have a happy ending either. After her divorce on July 1st, 1911, Isabel moved to New York, where her addiction to alcohol and narcotics dominated her life. With her health declining rapidly, the Butterfly was admitted to Metropolitan Hospital on March 28, 1917. Less than a month later, on April 19th, Isabel Springer, the woman who once had it all, died of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of just 37. Affairs of the heart also play a part in our next story. But for Harry Powers, it was all about money. The man known to his neighbours as Harry Powers was born Herman Drenthe in Beerte, the Netherlands, in 1892. As a young man, he emigrated to the United States, settling in Iowa with his parents before serving nearly 2 years overseas in World War I. By the time he returned to the US, Herman Drenthe had shed his former identity entirely, instead becoming Harry Powers. Unlike his parents, who clung to their native language and culture, Harry was eager to embrace the American dream by leaving his life as a poor immigrant farmer's son far behind him. And he had no desire to obtain the life he wanted through hard work alone. Instead, he took to the Lonely Hearts column in search of wealthy women. Finding a bride via newspaper advertisement was nothing new. The first known Lonely Hearts ad appeared in the 1600s, and ads seeking marriage and other relationships flourished in papers for centuries. In an era before the internet, dating apps, or 1-800 numbers, the newspaper was a lonely soul's best medium for reaching a future companion. Some ads were poetic, like the one written by a 44-year-old widow in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1899 that read in part, "Would like the hearthstone of her heart swept and the cobwebs brushed away." Others were more straightforward, like this one from the Atlanta Constitution in 1898. "Wealthy, lost mother, for whom I sacrificed youth, dread a lonely future, seek husband and true companion." If a fellow Lonely Heart spotted an ad that piqued their interest, they could write to an address provided in the ad and begin a correspondence to determine if a relationship would be mutually beneficial to both parties. While there is no way to know how many of these advertisements ended in happy marriages, there was no shortage of enthusiasm for finding love. One story in the Lincoln Star outlined how a woman from Michigan traveled to Nebraska in 1909 to meet a man she'd been corresponding with through a Lonely Hearts column. She planned to determine if they suited each other. In this case, she would marry him and take him back to her home state, where she owned a fine farm and had plenty of money. It was likely this sort of story that inspired Harry Powers to respond to an advertisement from a young woman named Luella Strother. Luella Strother owned a small grocery store in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and a farm in nearby Quiet Dell. Though financially comfortable, she longed for companionship and romance. When Harry Powers responded to her ad in 1927, the pair began a passionate correspondence that eventually led to a marriage proposal. 34-year-old Harry moved to West Virginia, wed Luella, and settled into newlywed life in Quiet Dell. Or so it would seem, until 4 years later, when he was arrested for murder. One would assume that Harry's marriage to Luella satisfied his desire for comfort and status. Though Clarksburg was no roaring metropolis, it boasted a robust economy through coal and glass production, and Luella's grocery did a decent business that kept the couple insulated from many of the hardships in the early years of the Great Depression. The family's farm in Quiet Dell was idyllic, settled among these smaller hills that spilled from the Blue Ridge Mountains. But Luella's matrimonial ad had sparked something in Harry. He saw how easily he could step into a life of ease and comfort. He didn't need another wife, but he wanted more money. And if he could convince other lonely women to share their wealth, all that was left to be done was dispose of the women. The Great Depression offered Harry the perfect conditions for his scheme. The collapse of the stock market and banking system meant that it wasn't uncommon for people to abruptly up sticks and leave in search of work and a better life. Families broke apart under the strain, with widespread evictions and homelessness scattering once tight-knit circles. Young people dropped out of school and took to the road. Husbands abandoned their families, and unmarried women yearned for a way to ease the burden on their parents. It was a time of desperation and disconnection, and in it, Powers thrived. According to some accounts, he spent much of his married years on the road under the guise of traveling for business. Either while at home or away, Harry began placing matrimonial ads with the American Friendship Society. One read, "Civil engineer, college education, worth $150,000 or more, has income from $400 to $3,000 per month. My business enterprises prevent me from making many social contacts. I am unable, therefore, to make the acquaintance of the right kind of women, as my properties are located through the Middle West. I believe I will settle there when married. I'm an elk and a mason, own a beautiful 10-room home completely furnished. My wife would have her own car and plenty of spending money." I'm quite tempted to answer that ad myself. The ad was signed Cornelius O. Pearson and listed a P.O. box in Clarksburg for interested parties to write to. It is not hard to imagine the kind of hope that would spark in the heart of a woman looking for love and financial stability in 1931. In the days following, the advertisements printing Powers' P.O. box was inundated with up to 20 letters a day from hopeful suitors. Among them was Asta Iker, a widowed mother of 3 from Park Ridge, Illinois. It remains unknown why Harry Powers selected Asta from the dozens of women who wrote to him, but the pair began a long correspondence. All the while, he was maintaining the illusion of being a faithful husband to Luella, and also carrying out a construction project. At the Quiet Dell farm property 7 miles from Clarksburg, Harry had contracted the building of an 18 by 20-foot building with a single room above ground and 4 concrete and tile rooms beneath. Luella had financed the construction to the tune of $700, some $13,000 today. After Harry told her he wanted a place to store vegetables, on June the 23rd, 1931, Powers, posing as Cornelius O. Pearson, arrived at the home of Asta Eicher for a short visit. He spent 2 days with the widow and her children, 14-year-old Greta, 12-year-old Harry, and 9-year-old Annabelle. Then the couple departed alone, leaving the children in the care of the family nurse, Elizabeth Abernathy. 5 days after the pair departed, Abernathy received a letter from Asta telling her that Cornelius would come for the children soon. On July the 1st, Cornelius reappeared as promised. He sent one of the Eicher children to the bank with a note and a check signed by Asta with instructions to fill the amount of the bank balance in on the check and give it to the child. However, the bank believed that the signature on the check was a forgery and refused to write in the amount. When the child returned home without the money, Cornelius hastily packed all 3 siblings into his car and drove off. Neither Asta nor her children would be seen alive again. Asta Eicher was not the only woman Harry Powers had been communicating with. Just 3 weeks after taking the Eicher children, Cornelius Pearson arrived at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Fleming of Northborough, Massachusetts. He had come to meet Mrs. Fleming's daughter, Dorothy Presley Lemke, whom he had been corresponding with for months. After introducing himself to Dorothy's parents, Cornelius stayed just one night before departing with his pen pal for Iowa, where they would be married. Before they left town, however, they stopped at 2 banks and withdrew $4,000 from Dorothy's accounts. Then they dropped her trunks off at the railway station to be shipped ahead of them. Unbeknownst to Dorothy, the trunks were not addressed to Iowa, where she believed Cornelius lived, but to Fairmont, West Virginia. Several days later, Harry Powers claimed the trunks alone. In the middle of August, Cornelius Pearson surfaced again in Park Ridge. This time, he paid a local neighbor to help him remove all of the possessions from Asta Eicher's home and listed it for rent for $75 per month. The commotion at the Eicher house aroused suspicions from other neighbors who called the police to investigate. Cornelius claimed to be managing the property on behalf of Asta and presented paperwork naming him as her agent. The police accepted his word but informed him that several $100s in interest were due on the home's mortgage, which Cornelius paid from a fat roll of bills. He told the police that Asta was in Colorado and had asked him to take charge of her affairs. The Park Ridge police chief had no reason to detain Cornelius Pearson, but his suspicions were raised. No one around town seemed to have heard from the Eichers after their abrupt departure, save for a school friend of Greta, who had received a letter from her pal describing what fun she was having and saying that the family was planning a trip to Europe. The letter was postmarked from Clarksburg, West Virginia. But Cornelius had said Asta was in Colorado. Probing further, the chief collected evidence from Elizabeth Abernathy, bank employees, and a former boarder at the Eicher house. A search of the home revealed the love letters that Asta had sent to Cornelius, and the chief decided it was time to check that the family was safe. On August 26, 1931, authorities in Illinois contacted Clarksburg Police Chief Clarence Duckworth and requested that local resident Cornelius O. Pearson be taken into custody for questioning. Of course, there was no such person in the Clarksburg area by that name. But a trip to the post office revealed that a post office box had been rented to Cornelius. The home address on file was 111 Quincy Street, where Harry Powers and his wife lived and ran their small grocery store. After it was confirmed that the physical description of Cornelius Pearson matched that of Harry Powers, he was arrested and detained to be questioned about the disappearance of Asta Eicher and her 3 children. The news of Harry Powers' arrest was reported in the Clarksburg Telegram the following day, and in a small area like Quiet Dell, it was a big story. The Harrison County Sheriff's Office received a tip from a woman whose mother's property adjoined the Strother Farm, where Harry Powers had recently built his storeroom. According to the tipster, her mother and other neighbors had noticed unpleasant smells emanating from the Strother property. The sheriff obtained a search warrant for the Quiet Dell farm, and on August 28th, 4 officers pried their way into the locked garage. In the tiled rooms below ground, the officers found a bloody footprint and strands of human hair. Nearby, they recovered a partially burnt bank book. Confident that the bodies of Asta and her children must be close by, the police drained a nearby well and brought Harry Powers to the farm to show him the evidence they'd collected, but he remained silent. By 1 p.m. that afternoon, over 300 local residents had gathered at the farm, drawn by the search. A 15-year-old boy told police that he had recently helped Powers dig a ditch between the garage and the creek, but it was now covered. The sheriff summoned men to help uncover it, and within minutes they unearthed the decomposing bodies of Asta Eicher and her 3 children. Asta and her 2 daughters had been strangled, while Harry had died after being struck in the head with a hammer. A 5th victim was also found with the belt used to strangle her still twisted around her neck. This was Dorothy Lemke. That night at the Harrison County Jail, Powers was subjected to hours of questioning before signing a statement confessing to the murders of the Eicher family. By the time the confession was signed and the sun rose, Powers was sporting 2 black eyes and extensive bruising, which officials claimed were a result of falling down the stairs. At the farm, police found another child bank book with the name Dorothy Pressler Lemke. The authorities in Worcester confirmed that Dorothy had left weeks earlier, and her decomposed body was identified through clothing and dental records. Inside Harry Powers' home, police uncovered a trunk filled with hundreds of letters from lonely women across the country. One writer, Edith Simpson of Detroit, had already made plans to marry Powers in the coming weeks. Her wedding dress had been purchased, and she had begun planning travel arrangements. The citizens of Harrison County were infuriated by the evil that Harry Powers had brought to their quiet hamlet. On September 20th, an angry mob of nearly 5,000 surrounded the county jail and demanded that Powers be turned over to them. The siege lasted over 2 hours and was ended only with the use of tear gas. In the early hours of the morning, the killer was whisked away to the federal penitentiary at Moundville to await trial. But the change of venue did nothing to quell public interest in the case. Public officials rented Moore's Opera House with a seating capacity of over 500 to accommodate the spectators. The prosecution elected to try Harry Powers for the Lemke murder, since there was more evidence tying him to the case. Over 5 days, the audience watched witnesses testify to seeing Powers and Lemke traveling together, withdrawing thousands from Dorothy Lemke's account, and seeing Powers collect her trunks from Fairmont. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict, and on December the 12th, 1931, Harry Powers was sentenced to death by hanging at Moundsville State Penitentiary. In the days before his execution, he was accused of being responsible for other murders, including that of Dudley Wade, a carpet sweeper salesman and former co-worker of Harry's who had disappeared in 1928. There was also speculation that he may be responsible for dozens more Lonely Heart killings, given his high volume of correspondence. But those accusations remain unproven. At 9 a.m. on March the 18th, 1932, Powers mounted the gallows in the yard of Moundsville Penitentiary. Before a guard slipped the black death cap over his head, he was asked if he wanted to make a final statement. But the man who had written millions of words of love and promise to hundreds of women was silent at last. If Harry's letters had wooed the woman in our next tale, I fear he may have met his match. On August the 1st, 1937, Colorado police were called to a local hospital to investigate the sudden death of 67-year-old George Obendorfer. The authorities learned that George, a cobbler, was visiting from Cincinnati, Ohio, and had been staying at a hotel with a female companion named Anna Marie Hahn and a young boy, but both were nowhere to be found. Around the same time, the hotel itself also filed a report about some jewelry that had gone missing from the premises. The police discovered that an attempt had been made to pawn these jewels at a local shop by a woman that matched Mrs. Hahn's description. But before the police could question her, Anna had already fled to Cincinnati. Colorado police then alerted their counterparts there about the woman, which ultimately led to the terrifying discovery that wherever Anna went, death seemed to follow. Anna Marie Filzer was born on July the 7th, 1906, to George Filzer, a well-off furniture manufacturer in Bavaria, Germany. She was the youngest of her 12 siblings, 5 of whom had died by the time she was born. In 1925, at age 19, Anna became pregnant with her son Oscar. Although she claimed that the father of her son was a Viennese physician and cancer researcher named Dr. Machecki, there has never been any record of him, and the real identity of Oscar's father is still unknown. Anna's pregnancy, out of wedlock, turned out to be scandalous for her family. She was shunned by the community, and her family decided that it was best to send her away. In 1929, Anna moved to the U.S. to live with her step-uncle Max and his wife, Anna DeShell, in Cincinnati, Ohio, while her son remained with her parents. She didn't live with them long, however, and moved out after about a month, much to the chagrin of the DeShells, whom she still owed $236 for her ship fare. Anna had apparently always spent money freely, but upon reaching the States, she also developed a gambling addiction. An early $2 wager that returned her $260 quickly led her to placing bets of up to $50 a day. To help fund this and her other spending habits, Anna had lied about studying to become a nurse back in Germany and was working as a carer of sorts for 71-year-old Charles Oswald. The retired baker, who had recently lost his wife, found Anna charming and attractive, and he soon began harboring ideas the pair would one day marry. On the surface, Anna seemed to reciprocate these feelings, but in truth, she was using Charles's infatuation to wring money from him. This would include $700 being transferred into her account and 27 shares in Union Gas being signed over to her, which Oswald would later deny doing. Unbeknownst to him, Anna had met a telegraph operator named Philip Hahn at a community dance, with the pair beginning a relationship that progressed at a pace. Just months later, on May the 5th, 1930, they were married, with Anna later returning to Bavaria to collect her son and bring him to the US. At least, that's one version of events, as there are differing reports of Anna's early life and immigration to the US. Some suggest that she married the Austrian doctor she claimed was Oscar's father, but he died shortly after they moved to Ohio. Others, however, say that she met Philip in Germany, with the pair marrying before moving to the US after Philip found a job there. Regardless of how she got to the US, the story of Anna's terrifying crimes begins after her marriage to Hahn. Things initially began well for the pair. Anna sold most of the shares she had obtained, and they were able to use the money to set up a delicatessen. However, things soon went downhill. Neither of the Hahns were particularly good with money, and business was slow, leading to them selling the delicatessen and setting up another nearby, though this too failed to take off. Their issues were compounded when Charles, who had not been aware of Anna's marriage, discovered that she was now another man's wife and that she also had a child. Enraged, he attempted to sue her for breach of promise and sought the return of the shares he had signed over to her. The case would eventually be dropped. By this point, the Hahns were renting a room from a man named Ernest Kohler, with Anna quick to use her charms on the 62-year-old teamster, doing jobs for him around the 3-story home. Despite initially being wary of the family moving into the home, within weeks, Anna had worked her way into the man's will. While the Hahns rented one room, another was occupied by a doctor named Arthur Voss, who claimed that during his time there, pads he used for writing prescriptions went missing. It's believed that Anna used these to illegally obtain morphine. On May the 6th, 1933, Ernest Kohler died suddenly, less than a year after the Hahns had moved in. In his will, he left Anna the house, its furnishings, and the money in his savings account. In all, she inherited cash and property worth some $13,000, roughly $300,000 in today's money. At the time, Ernest had been suffering from throat cancer, and so his death wasn't initially seen as suspicious, though his family were outraged by the contents of his will. While it's easy to assume that this windfall would have seen many of the Hahns' troubles disappear, Anna's spending, along with her gambling habit, meant that just 2 years later, the couple would have to sell their business to make ends meet. Before this, it's stated that Anna had stolen items and money from friends and even set several fires at the business and their home in order to collect insurance money. This last tactic seemed to work well for her, as she's believed to have pocketed some $2,300. It's unclear how much Philip, who was now working as a taxi driver, knew of his wife's actions. Their marriage was on the rocks, with Philip angry at Anna's spending, whilst she had grown bored of him. The final straw would come when Anna twice tried to convince Philip to take out life insurance. While he was staunchly against it, it's believed that she was able to forge documents to insure his life for $5,000. Shortly thereafter, both Philip and his mother fell ill, and despite Anna's protests, both were admitted to hospital. They would eventually recover, though the Hahns' marriage would not. This setback in her plans was compounded when Charles Oswald died. And though Anna was the prime beneficiary in his will, she was told that there were no assets left in his estate. At this time, the US was already in the first few years of the Great Depression, and Anna probably appeared as an angel to the elderly men she cared for, and she soon found a new victim. In 1936, she met 72-year-old Albert Parker at a local casino. The pair seemingly became quick friends, with Albert taking trips with Anna and her son, often ending with a meal at her home. Again, she soon found herself caring for the elderly gentleman. However, it appears she was unable to work her way into his will. Instead, she secured a series of loans from the retired railroad watchman. Tragically, on March the 26th, 1937, after suffering severe stomach cramps, Albert would pass away before Anna could have a chance to repay him. 2 months later, she began caring for 78-year-old Jakob Wagner. Wagner was a retired gardener, and Anna had seemingly tried to convince his neighbors that she was his niece. Soon enough, money and items began to disappear from the property, and when challenged, Anna would make excuses that Jakob apparently believed. On June the 1st, just weeks after they had first met, Anna found Jakob in bed, writhing in pain, vomiting, and passing blood. Though he was obviously in need of help, she waited hours before alerting doctors. 2 days later, he was dead, with his will bequeathing his supposed niece some $17,000. 1 month later, another man named George Selman, who had hired Anna as a caretaker, also passed away. He was 67 and apparently left $15,000 to Anna for her work around his house, which again involved cooking and cleaning. It was certainly no coincidence that 4 elderly men that Anna had cared for died mysteriously, often leaving her vast sums of money. But the police still hadn't caught on. Her friendly demeanor and charm didn't make her stand out as a stereotypical serial killer, and even if she had murdered them, the question was, how? Things came to light only after Anna claimed another victim, George Obendorfer, a 67-year-old lonely widow who was smitten with her. In late July, George traveled to Denver with Anna and her son, Oscar. There, they checked into a hotel, and George suddenly fell ill in his hotel room. Soon, he was unable to walk without aid. Anna decided this wouldn't stop her from enjoying the trip. And so, while he was doubled up in pain, she and her son took in the sights. When they were done, Anna took George to a local hospital and left him there. On August the 1st, 1937, he passed away. When the doctors were left confused by the cause of his death, they called for local police to investigate. The authorities talked to the hospital staff and the hotel staff, who reported a jewelry theft on the same day. They also told them of the 2 companions the man had checked in with, a young woman and a young boy, but by now they were already gone. Soon after, the investigators' attention was drawn to a report from a pawn shop in the area that stated a woman and a boy matching Anna and Oscar's description had tried to sell the items that had been reported stolen. Anna had also tried to withdraw $1,000 of George's money from a bank in Denver, claiming to be his wife. Believing that she would be on her way back to Ohio, Denver authorities issued a warrant for her arrest and alerted their counterparts there. As soon as she arrived back in the state, Anna was arrested. During questioning, she initially denied knowing George, but when faced with the fact she had checked into a room with the man, she stated she had only met him on a train journey to Denver. She accompanied him because he seemed to be in bad health, and she felt sorry for him. When Obendorfer's family told authorities that the pair had seemingly been in a relationship and he had until recently been in good health, Anna's story began to fall apart. The final nail in the coffin for her version of events came when her son told police that his mother had bought George's ticket in Cincinnati and that she had served him several drinks on the train. It was only after these that he became ill. Though the motive was obvious, the means of the murder only became clear when an autopsy revealed high levels of deadly croton oil. Suspecting Anna's involvement in the deaths of other elderly men she had cared for, the bodies of Zellman and Wagner were exhumed for testing. They showed that Zellman too had consumed a large amount of croton oil, while Wagner had seemingly been poisoned with arsenic. Though death came quickly to most men who welcomed Anna into their home, there was one man who managed to escape, though not unscathed: George Heiss. Heiss and Anna had become friends while Anna was buying coal. As with others, she would help him with his household, make him drinks, and he would often loan her money. George eventually started to feel unwell, but could not understand why until one day when Anna served him a mug of beer. He watched as a couple of houseflies flew into his drink and died on the spot. He quickly grew suspicious, and his suspicions were seemingly confirmed when he asked Anna to take a sip from his drink, but she refused. After this incident, Anna was asked to pack her bags and leave. However, Heiss never informed the police about this, which led to the deaths of other men, and even though he survived, he was left permanently paralyzed. After the police learned about the murders, they searched Anna's home and are said to have found enough poison to kill half of Cincinnati. Anna tried to deny her crimes, but her husband, Philip, informed the officials that she had, in fact, stolen the prescriptions from Dr. Voss's office. He also came clean about the reasons why he was estranged from his wife. He confessed that his wife had tried to insure him, but that he rejected the idea. Shortly after rejecting this idea for the second time, he suddenly fell ill. Later, he had found a bottle of poison and hidden it away as he feared his wife was going to use it on him. With a solid case being formed against her, and to prevent her from being extradited to Colorado, on August the 10th, 1937, Ohio authorities charged Anna Hahn with the murder of Jakob Wagner. Her trial went on for 4 weeks, and she pled not guilty. During this time, she received a lot of press coverage, giving interviews from her jail cell. She would tell the reporters that she had only tried to bring comfort to the old men who had fallen ill. The press dubbed her as the beautiful blonde killer, Arsenic Anna, and the blonde Borgia. Throughout her trial, she stuck to her story and consistently tried to appear nun-like, always being sure to wear a large crucifix. Eventually, after Heiss's testimony, that of Jakob Wagner's neighbors who had seen her bring drinks to him, and many forensic reports, a jury found Anna Hahn guilty of murder with no recommendation of mercy. With this, she was automatically sentenced to death. The sentence was due to be carried out on March the 10th, 1938, but appeals led to this being delayed until December the 7th. As she entered the room where the electric chair stood, Anna Hahn is said to have passed out. When she came round, she was strapped into the chair where she pleaded to be released, but this wasn't to be. In letters she wrote before her death, she confessed to the murders. In one, she states, quote, "I don't know how I could have done the things I did in my life. Only God knows what came over me when I gave Albert Parker, the first one, the poison that caused his death. When I think of that poison even now, I feel a strange something come over me. Something happens to my mind. I do not try to excuse myself for my actions. They were not me at all. I have made my peace with God, and someday He will explain to me what caused my mind to become so warped to do these things. It all seems like a terrible dream." Unquote. These letters were sold to and published by the Cincinnati Enquirer, with the money going to her son, Oscar. After his mother's death, it's said that instead of staying with his stepfather, Philip, his name was changed and he was fostered by a family living in the Midwest. While no doubt evil, you can at least understand the motive behind the acts in our previous cases. Our next tale, however, though solved, still leaves you asking why. The Peterson family lived near the small village of Shell Lake in Saskatchewan, Canada. In the quaint village, children attended school, enjoyed horseback riding, and assisted with household and farm chores. This was your typical sleepy town where little of note happens, and whatever does become headlines the next day. For many young people, the dream is often to escape such a place, to get out and explore what else the world may hold in store for you. Kathy Peterson Hill would make it out of that sleepy little town, but many of her family wouldn't have the same luck. A single paved road ran between the canola fields directly to a humble white farmhouse. This was the house of James Frederick Hudson Peterson. During World War II, James served abroad and came back to Saskatchewan in 1945. The Veterans Land Act of 1942, which was a program assisting war veterans in acquiring land for farming and settling in rural areas, helped him buy a small piece of land close to where he grew up. Soon after his return, James fell in love with a girl named Evelyn Nathan. Evelyn was born to Norman and Martha Finlayson on July the 23rd, 1925, in Borden, Saskatchewan. Despite growing up close to each other, the pair only really connected after his return from the war, with their romance quickly flourishing, leading to a marriage on September the 25th, 1946. They soon started their family with their first child, Kathy, arriving within a year, followed by 8 more over the next 2 decades, including Jean, Mary, Dorothy, Pearl, William, Phyllis, Colin, and baby Larry. Kathy Hill recalls her father as a diligent and dependable man, mostly occupied with farming. Sundays were for church, but he worked hard during the rest of the week. He was generally mild-mannered, though he had a short fuse, possibly a holdover from his war experiences. He never liked being disturbed in his sleep because he would always wake up ready for a fight. Despite that, he was loving and ensured all his children had a good upbringing. Evelyn, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and easygoing, hardly ever raising her voice. She cherished her quiet mornings milking the cows, a rare moment of peace in a house bustling with 9 children. Growing up in such a lively household was chaotic but joyful for Kathy. There was always someone to play with, and summers were spent with cousins and extended family. Wanting to be closer to local amenities in their advanced years, James's parents left their home near Shell Lake to move closer to town. Not wanting to lose the home he had grown up in, James moved his large family from the farm he had bought post-war to the 2-bedroom property. It was smaller, but it was comfortable, providing a warmer place to stay during the colder months. With 2 bedrooms and a fold-out couch in the living room, the space was cramped, but the family had never been happier. Having 11 people in the home often led to 3 sharing a bed, with the siblings taking turns to be the one left to sleep on the couch. Outside, the Peterson family's dog, Skippy, was a familiar sight in the front yard, eagerly welcoming known visitors with cheerful barking. In July of 1967, just a month before tragedy struck, Peterson's eldest daughter, Kathy, married a man named Lee Hill in the same church where her parents had wed 21 years earlier. At age 19, Kathy's wedding was a small affair with limited space. Not all their cousins could attend, but her immediate family were present. Her sister Jean was a bridesmaid, and her mother helped style her hair and add finishing touches to her bridal attire. James proudly walked Kathy down the aisle, looking sharp in a well-fitting suit he had had since his time in the army. Just 2 days after the wedding, Kathy and Lee packed their car to start anew in Chetwynd, British Columbia, where Lee had his job. The Peterson family didn't have a phone, so they knew it would be some time before they spoke to Kathy again. Jean, especially at 17, found this hard to accept. Upon their departure, after heartfelt goodbyes, Jean tearfully expressed her fear of never seeing Kathy again. This apparent unfounded fear would in fact prove tragically prophetic. With Kathy leaving, life on the farm continued mostly unchanged for the rest of the Peterson family. Despite missing their eldest daughter, their 8 children kept their parents quite busy. Jean, who was athletically gifted, was slated to attend a Legion track and field camp at Dundurn by the end of August, with James working hard to fund it. On August 14th, a close family friend and neighbour, Will Drew Lang, visited the modest little farmhouse for dinner. James and Will spent time together, while Evelyn tended the garden and the children played in the yard. The 2 men discussed their plans for the following day, deciding to clean feed bins and transport around 50 bushels of wheat to a nearby grain elevator. James hoped to earn about $70 from the sale and use the money for Jean's upcoming state camp and a family trip to Dundurn to visit her. As the evening continued, Will lingered with his old friend, but eventually left to rest up for the next day's work. James walked him to the driveway, the moon casting a bright glow over their farewell. Unknown to Will, this would be the last night anyone saw the Peterson family alive. Early on the morning of August 15th, 1967, Victor Ernest Hoffman woke up abruptly at 3 a.m. It had been 3 weeks since his discharge from the Saskatchewan hospital in North Battleford, known for its treatment of severe mental illnesses. Victor had shown great improvements during his treatment, prompting his doctors to confidently let the 21-year-old go with nothing but a prescription for some tranquilizers. This was great news for Victor, who had always been a troubled boy. He had been battling previously undiagnosed schizophrenia, which caused him to start hallucinating by age 6, often seeing a devil-like figure he would later describe as standing around 6'6", with a long, slender tail. He would also see angels who would battle the demon, he believed, to save his soul. Despite this, he claimed on one occasion that the devil promised him riches should he kneel before him. Victor bowed, believing that by not fully submitting, he would still receive wealth, but keep his soul. By 10, Victor frequently felt urges to kill. Despite the supposed angels telling him not to, he directed this aggression towards animals and began displaying increasingly alarming behavior. In his mid-teens, this began to include burglary, as he twice robbed a local firearms store, taking guns and ammunition. A one-time friend of the boy would later state that he etched a name onto each of his bullets. A neighbor discovering his hoard of stolen goods would eventually lead to Victor receiving a 2-year suspended sentence. In 1967, a 21-year-old Hoffman was caught by his mother firing his gun into the sky. He told her that he had shot the devil. Being deeply religious Lutherans, his parents arranged for him to speak with a local pastor. When he told the man that he liked to kill, They knew that something had to be done, and Victor was committed to the Saskatchewan Mental Hospital. At the time, treatments for schizophrenia were significantly less advanced. Victor received tranquilizers which only really sedated him without addressing the root cause. He also underwent electroconvulsive therapy with a recovery period often marked by memory loss. The doctors initially warned his parents of his severe condition, suggesting it might be a lengthy treatment. Imagine their pleasant surprise when only 2 months later they received a letter from the hospital stating their son was eligible for discharge. Robert drove to Saskatchewan Hospital to pick up his son. When the pair returned home, he noticed that Victor was quieter than usual and his movements seemed a little stiff. Not wishing to stress him or rob him of a distraction, he told his son he could do as much or as little work on the farm as he wanted. Victor would later tell his mother that when it came to farm chores, he only had one request, that he not be asked to behead chickens. He begged her not to ask him to. Perhaps there had been a change in his ways, and perhaps if he had stuck to his medication and kept to his follow-up appointments at the Prince Albert Hospital Mental Health Clinic, a tragedy would have been avoided. Sadly, this wasn't to be. Victor Hoffman had spent the days leading up to the massacre in something of a daze. On August the 8th, 2 weeks after his release, he stopped taking his meds and slowly sank back into his old ways, fantasizing about murder. On August the 14th, after spending a day in the fields, he fell asleep on the sofa of his parents' home, promptly being sent to bed when they discovered him. However, at 3 a.m. he awoke and became restless, aimlessly wandering his family farm near Leask, Saskatchewan, and briefly tinkered with an engine in the garage. At one point, he contemplated killing one of the family dogs barking outside, but restrained himself. He had to keep his impulses under control because Victor feared the hospital more than death itself. Instead, he decided to take a drive. Filling his grey 1950 Plymouth with gasoline, he set out with his .22 caliber Browning pump-action repeater rifle in the front seat. Driving aimlessly at first, he eventually found himself nearing the small farming community of Shell Lake. Passing myriad farmhouses, his urge to kill continuing to grow. Just before dawn, he pulled up outside the Petersons' home. Later, he would claim that a voice told him, "This is it. This is where you have to go and do it." He slowly drove down the driveway, stopping to open and close 2 gates on the way before parking in front of the small white farmhouse. Evelyn woke up early that morning to feed baby Larry, while James prepared for the long day ahead. The other children were still asleep. 11-year-old Dorothy on the fold-out cot in the living room, and in the second bedroom, 17-year-old Jean, 13-year-old Marie, and 4-year-old Phyllis shared one bed, while 9-year-old Pearl, 5-year-old William, and 3-year-old Colin occupied the other. With his gun in hand, Victor entered the Peterson home. James, hearing the sound, called out, "Who is it?" When he spotted Victor, the pair began to grapple, with James being shot several times in his desperate struggle to protect his family before he finally fell. For a moment, Hoffman then left the home as screams began to ring out. Moments later, he returned and shot James once more before horrifically turning his weapon on the children, 2 of whom pleaded for their lives before being brutally executed. Evelyn, trying to flee with baby Larry, was caught outside. Hoffman spared neither of them. The only member of the Peterson family to survive the slaughter was 4-year-old Phyllis. Some claim that this was because she was hidden either beneath the bed covers or the bed itself, while Hoffman would later claim it was because he believed she had the face of an angel. After the murders, Victor carefully collected most of the cartridge casings, along with 2 wallets containing some $7 before leaving the scene. As dawn began to break, Will Drew arrived at the Peterson farmhouse. Having made plans with James Peterson for a busy workday, Will was surprised by the lack of greeting. Assuming the family was just sleeping in, he started working on the feed bins by himself. But when James didn't show up by 9 a.m., highly unusual for a farmer and a disciplined ex-army man, Will went up to the house to check on things. For the first time, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, and Skippy wasn't around with his usual cheerful barks. Pushing the door open, Will was confronted with a horrifying sight. James was motionless inside the front door in a pool of his own blood. In shock, Will retreated and raced the 6.5 kilometers to the nearest phone in the village in James's station wagon. After alerting the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he hurried back to the Peterson farm. On his way back, Will saw Alvin Seminar working in his field with his son, Dennis. Alvin's family lived just across the highway from the Petersons. Alvin's daughter Gail, along with his wife Marjorie and cousin Bernice, were preparing salsa in the kitchen after attending to their usual everyday farm duties. But when the family saw Will Lang driving James's car to their home, they all knew something was wrong. Marjorie, unable to hear the conversation from inside, could only watch as Alvin's face changed from mild confusion to complete horror. Alvin left with Lang in James's station wagon, and Dennis, only 10 years old at the time, gathered the horses scattered around the yard. As he crossed the field, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police vehicles arrived. After a thorough sweep of the house, Corporal Barry Richards discovered 4-year-old Phyllis miraculously alive amidst the tragic aftermath. He carried her out, stepping past James's bloody body. Marjorie, initially thinking James Peterson might have suffered a heart attack, hurried to the Peterson residence herself, only to find her husband holding Phyllis, her small form almost completely covered in blood. In a state of shock, Marjorie, without a word, took Phyllis from Alvin's arms and marched back to her home to clean the little girl off. On August the 19th, 1967, hours after the burial of the Peterson family, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police apprehended Victor Ernest Hoffman without incident. He was found in his parents' home in Leask, about 65 kilometers southeast of where the murders took place. Following his capture, Hoffman shared that he had battled a demonic figure before making his way to the Peterson home. He depicted this entity as towering, dark, and having no genitalia. Subsequently, Hoffman was detained at the psychiatric facility in North Battleford, where experts diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Finally, on January the 11th, 1968, Victor Ernest Hoffman was acquitted due to insanity for the murders of James and Evelyn Peterson. But the story hardly ends there. Throughout the 4-day trial, Hoffman displayed a chilling lack of emotion, his gaze fixed on his feet, his face devoid of any expression. Even as the verdict was announced, he gave no reaction, and he seemed not to register what had just happened as the police led him away. Just 4 days before his 22nd birthday, Victor Hoffman was taken and kept at the Prince Albert Correctional Centre pending decisions on the course of his mental health treatment. The community, of course, was completely outraged. Victor's attempts to erase his crimes by picking up the bullet casings from around the house proved he was fully aware of what he was doing. 8 days after the verdict, the Saskatchewan government announced Hoffman's continued detention in Prince Albert amid reviews of the North Battleford Hospital's facilities. On February the 12th, 1968, it was declared that they were inadequate to treat Hoffman, so he was transferred to a specialized hospital in Penetanguishene, Ontario. He would be detained there until 2001, when he was granted supervised visits to the towns of Midland, Port McNicoll, and Penetanguishene. At the time, this caused massive outrage. 3 years later, he died of cancer. In 1992, he granted several interviews to author and journalist Peter Tadman, who was, at that point in time, set to release a book about the massacre. Tadman stated that Hoffman felt no guilt for his actions and claimed to still see the devil. The massacre shook the people of Shell Lake and its surrounding communities. Doors that would normally be left open were now locked, and many people began to sleep with a firearm nearby. The Seminoff family, who lived near the Petersons, found grappling with the aftermath particularly difficult. Despite attempts to maintain normality, the family's life was irreversibly altered. Intrusive visits to the crime scene continued for years after, with people, including nosy reporters, stopping by and some even stealing mementos. Kathy and her husband, Lee, having moved to British Columbia, returned to the home James had purchased with the help of the Veterans Land Act, which wasn't far from the site of the tragedy. Kathy found it hard to escape the shadow of the event, but despite those challenges, she focused on building a stable, happy life for her family. By 1974, she and Lee had children of their own, who they raised alongside her sister Phyllis, providing her with the familial support she needed. Intruders continued to visit the old Peterson home until the early 1990s, when Kathy received a phone call that the house was on fire. The culprit was never found, and Kathy wanted to let the house burn. Its destruction almost came as a relief to the sisters, who were finally rid of the physical reminder of the pain. The family gravesite, intended as a solemn place of remembrance, has now transformed into a morbid tourist spot, disrupting the family's peace, even in death. The daughters stopped visiting the graves after a while, and amidst this sorrow, the story of Phyllis, the sole survivor, ended on a poignant note. After battling cancer, she departed, choosing to be laid to rest in a secluded, tranquil place, far from the shadow of the Peterson family grave and the public eye. Though a most tragic crime, our next story also showcases the strength of the one who survived. Richard Benjamin Speck was born in 1941, 200 miles west of Chicago in Kirkwood, Illinois. He was the seventh of 8 children born to Mary Carver and Benjamin Franklin Speck. His mother was a teetotaler and devout Christian, but after his father died in 1947, she remarried a hard drinker named Carl Lindbergh. Under the influence of his new stepfather, who had a lengthy criminal record, Speck struggled immensely in school and began drinking at age 12. The family moved frequently, and at age 13, he was arrested for the first time for trespassing. By age 15, he was getting drunk nearly every day and dropped out of school at 16, having only completed the 8th grade. He eventually found work at the 7-Up bottling company in Dallas, but continued to collect misdemeanors. In 1961, Speck met Shirley Malone at the Texas State Fair. 15-year-old Shirley became pregnant after 3 weeks of dating, and the pair wed the following year. A year after his daughter's birth, Speck was sentenced to 3 years in prison for forgery and burglary, but was paroled after 16 months. Free for just a few weeks, he was arrested again when he attacked a woman in the parking lot of her apartment building with a 17-inch carving knife. A clerical error resulted in him serving just 6 months of a 16-month sentence. Shirley Malone was likely far from pleased to have her husband returned to her. Speck was a cruel, terrifying man who often assaulted her at knife point. Fearful of his ever-growing aggression, Shirley filed for divorce and fled with her child. Speck continued wreaking havoc in Dallas, racking up 41 arrests before his younger sister Carolyn dropped him at a bus depot, insisting he return to Illinois for a fresh start. But the relocation did nothing to quell her brother's penchant for drugs, alcohol, and violence. Speck initially stayed with family friends in Monmouth, Illinois, where his brother found him work helping a carpenter. Despite having familial support, Richard soon began to fall back into his old ways. This was only accelerated when he learned that his now ex-wife had remarried 2 days after the divorce had been granted. Not long after this, he threatened a man with a knife, robbed a grocery store, and then burgled and assaulted a 65-year-old woman, tying her up and stealing the $2.50 she had earned babysitting that evening. His crimes would soon escalate further. On April the 13th, 1966, the body of a barmaid, Mary Catherine Pierce, was found in an empty hog house behind the tavern she worked at. She died from a severe blow to the abdomen that had ruptured her liver. Due to the fact that he was known to frequent the bar where Mary worked and no doubt his long list of arrests, Richard Speck was questioned and told to stay in town as authorities wanted to quiz him further. When police arrived at Speck's lodgings the next day, they discovered he'd skipped town. He had fled to Chicago, where he moved in with his sister Martha on the city's northwest side. There he spun a web of lies, claiming he had been forced to leave Monmouth after he refused to become a crime syndicate drug mule. Martha's husband, Gene, had previously served in the U.S. Navy and so was able to help Speck find work with the United States Merchant Marine, working as an apprentice seaman. Once his application had been processed, he quickly found work on the Clarence B. Randall, but this soon came to an end after he fell ill with appendicitis. The next few weeks and months saw Speck making regular visits, often under pressure from his sister, to the National Maritime Union hiring hall looking for work. He didn't have much luck, and when he did find work, drink would often see it brought to a swift end. By July, Gene and Martha had grown tired of Speck's excuses, and on July the 11th, Gene dropped Speck off at the NMU hiring hall and told him to stay until he found a ship to take him. After 2 days, he grew tired of waiting and took the $25 his sister had given him to the taverns. After a day of drinking, he sexually attacked 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper and stole her .22 caliber Rome pistol. Armed, drunk, and angry, Speck set out to find another target. A mile into his stroll of Chicago's South Side, he stumbled across a row of townhouses in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. At 11 p.m., Speck broke in through the window of 2319 East 100th Street. It seems, at least initially, to burgle the place. But at some point he discovered he'd come across a dormitory that housed 8 student nurses. His plans changed. The Jeffrey Manor townhouse was one of 3 that the South Chicago Community Hospital rented to house student nurses. While they were required to live in a dorm attached to the hospital during the first 2 years, the female students were permitted to room together at the townhouses during their final year. While the simple townhomes were not luxurious, senior students relished the extra independence that came with the privilege. The small home had 1 bathroom and 3 bedrooms upstairs, with a living room, kitchen and powder room on the first floor. The tight quarters made the nurses who lived there fast friends. When Richard Speck broke in that unusually cool July night, the townhouse was home to 8 student nurses: Corazon Amorao, Melita Gargulo, and Valentina Pasion, all 23 and from the Philippines, and 5 American students: 20-year-old Patricia Matusek, 20-year-old Pamela Wilkening, and 24-year-old Nina Schmale, 22-year-old Gloria Davy, and 21-year-old Suzanne Farris. Most of the women had worked the earliest 7 a.m. till 3 p.m. shift that day, so they were in their beds when Speck entered. The first door he knocked on was that of Corazon and Melita. The knock was soft, and Corazon assumed it was one of the other nurses, afraid to wake them if they were sleeping. She slipped out of the top bunk and walked to the door. When she opened it, she was met by Speck, tall, lanky, with slicked back blonde hair and a face full of pockmarks, holding a small black revolver in one hand. Speck forced Corazon and Melita out of the room and herded them into the largest bedroom, rousing the other nurses as he went. The 3 Filipino nurses took the opportunity to barricade themselves in a closet. The only phone in the house was downstairs in the kitchen. They couldn't call for help, so they needed to keep the intruder at bay. But soon, one of the American nurses spoke to them calmly through the door. "He won't hurt us," the voice said, and the 3 women opened the closet. Speck forced the 6 nurses to sit in a circle on the floor. An unspoken plan formed amongst the women: stay calm, follow his directions, and maybe we'll live. Speck was quiet and even seemed gentle. He explained to the nurses that he had unlocked the back door by reaching through a window and wanted money. He led them together through the house to collect their purses and gathered their cash into a single stack. Then he led them back into the largest bedroom and counted them again to ensure no one had escaped. In the street below, Gloria Davy was saying goodnight to her fiancé after letting herself in through the back door. She used the phone in the kitchen to call her parents. It was part of her routine to call and let her mum know she was safely inside for the night, even though her childhood home was within walking distance of the townhouse. Not hearing any movement upstairs, Gloria assumed her housemates were asleep, and she quickly padded up the stairs to her room. At the top, Speck waited for her. He ordered Gloria to empty her pocketbook and then took her to join the other women. "Don't be afraid. I'm not going to kill you," he told her. He began ripping bed sheets into strips, casually chatting with the women as he worked, and stopping for cigarette breaks. He tied their wrists behind their backs and their ankles together. When only Melita and Corazon remained unbound, the doorbell rang. Speck walked the 2 nurses downstairs to see who was at the door. Cora, likely recognizing the difference between the sound of the front and back doorbells, deliberately led Speck to the front of the house. Meanwhile, Tammy was turning to walk away from the back door. By the time they checked the second door, she was gone, and Corazon had spared her next-door neighbor from a horrific fate. When the trio returned upstairs, Speck grabbed Pamela Wilkening and placed a gun to her back. He ordered her to the other bedroom. The remaining nurses listened as Pamela made a small noise and then fell silent. On the other side of the wall, Speck had shoved a cloth in her mouth and was beginning to sexually assault her. It was then that the final roommate, Suzanne Farris, arrived home for the night, accompanied by her friend, Mary Ann Jordan. Now, there were 9 women in the house with Richard Speck. They climbed the stairs and discovered Speck assaulting Pamela. Suzanne and Mary Ann turned to run, but Speck slipped in front of them and blocked the stairs. He forced them into the bedroom with Pamela and viciously attacked them with a switchblade. Suzanne was stabbed multiple times and strangled with a nylon stocking. Marianne and Pamela also both received fatal stab wounds. Speck then callously tossed a sheet over the bodies and walked to the bathroom to clean up. In the larger bedroom, the remaining women were trying to devise a plan to escape. They had assumed Speck would steal from them and leave, but now they knew he was not just a burglar. The Filipino nurses wanted to throw a lamp out the window to attract attention. The Americans argued that their best bet was staying calm and doing whatever Speck wanted. As they discussed in heated whispers, Speck returned. He took Nina next, then Valentina. Each time Speck was careful to make sure his victims didn't make any noise and washed his hands and knife before returning to the bedroom. This way, none of the nurses knew exactly what fate awaited them. They were unsure if the ones who had been led away were injured, dead, or simply tied up elsewhere in the house. In the commotion of Speck taking the nurses from the room, Corazon slipped under one of the bunk beds and wiggled as far against the wall as possible. After Valentina, Speck took Melita, then Patricia, who he left dead on the bathroom floor covered with blood. He no longer cared about concealing his victims from the others. There was only Corazon hidden under the bed and Gloria left. Gloria had drank quite a bit of champagne that evening and fell asleep shortly after Speck tied her up, blissfully unaware of what was unfolding around her. At 2:30 a.m., he returned to the bedroom again, slamming the door behind him. The noise startled Gloria awake. From her hiding spot, Corazon watched as Speck set upon her housemate and then dragged her from the room. Corazon was sure that the intruder must realize that she was in the room somewhere and decided to change her hiding place before he returned. She wiggled out from under the bed and inched across the room, determined not to make a sound. She slipped under the other bottom bunk and covered herself with a blanket. When Speck returned nearly an hour later, he glanced around the empty bedroom and left. Somewhere in his haze of murder and malice, he'd lost count of the women. Corazon lay silent for hours, terrified Speck was lying in wait. At 6 a.m., she pulled herself free and walked through the house, which was now a scene of bloody horror. She knocked out a screen on the second story and began screaming for help. "They're all dead," she cried, over and over. Despite the horrific trauma she'd endured, she was able to tell the police that the man who'd murdered her roommates was white, in his early 20s, had a serpent tattoo on one arm and another that said, "Born to raise hell." On July the 16th, a man named Claude Lunsford contacted police to inform him that he had recognized the man posted in sketches as Richard Speck. He informed them that the pair had been drinking the night before and he was now staying at the Star Hotel. While police have records of the call, they did not respond to it. On July 17th, however, a doctor at Cook County Hospital named Leroy Smith treated a man who had attempted to take his own life. As he sponged blood away from the man's arm, he revealed a tattoo, "Born to raise hell." He quickly alerted police, and Corazon, in her nurse's uniform, identified him in his hospital bed. Once arrested and charged, Richard Speck faced 8 counts of first-degree murder and the death penalty. While he waited trial, Speck was interviewed by Cook County Jail psychiatrist Dr. Marvin Zipperin. Zipperin stated that he believed Speck suffered from organic brain syndrome caused by brain injuries he had suffered in his youth. When he was 3 months old, he suffered a bout of pneumonia, which led to him spending a month in an oxygen tent. In an interview, Zipperin states that he believes this meant Speck's developing brain was starved of enough oxygen to develop normally. He also said that Speck suffered an amazing amount of head injuries. However, a panel of psychiatrists found him able to stand trial. Despite his time with the defendant, Zaporin would not be called to testify for either the defense or prosecution. After it was found, he planned to write a book about Speck from which he would benefit financially. In 1967, he and co-writer Jack Altman gave an interview about their thoughts on Speck. I'll leave a link to it in the comments below, but I will state that at times it can be a frustrating listen. The trial would eventually take place in April of 1967. The accused stated that he was high and drunk at the time of the attack and had no memory of the event. He had, however, confessed to Dr. Leroy Smith, but because he had been sedated at the time, it was decided that this wouldn't stand in court. This meant the case hinged on the prosecution's star witness. For over a year, Corazon Amorao had been closely protected by authorities. Now was her time to take to the stand. Despite some doctors believing she'd lapse into psychosis if asked about what happened on that night, Corazon stood strong and testified in great detail about the man's murderous rampage through the nurse's home and met his eyes as she identified him to the jury. On April the 15th, that jury took 49 minutes to reach a guilty verdict on all counts, and Richard Speck was sentenced to death. This wasn't the end of the story, however. In 1971, the killer's sentence was overturned when an appellate court found that over 250 potential jurors had been eliminated due to their conscientious or religious beliefs about the death penalty. While Speck awaited new sentencing, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, and Speck's sentence was commuted to 400 to 1,200 years in prison. Speck served his 8 life sentences at the Statesville Correctional Center. He granted only one press interview to a Chicago Tribune columnist. In the 1978 meeting, he admitted publicly to the murders for the first time and said he'd blacked out during the killings. Speck was also interviewed by legendary FBI profiler John Douglas. He told Douglas that he enjoyed keeping birds in his cell. Once, he'd nursed an injured sparrow back to health and tied a string around its leg, taking it everywhere perched on his shoulder. When a guard told Speck pets weren't allowed, the killer walked over to a spinning fan and tossed the little creature into its blades. "If I can't have it, no one can," Speck said. On December the 5th, 1991, Richard Speck died of a heart attack, 1 day shy of his 50th birthday. 5 years later, an anonymous source gave a video to a Chicago news anchor. The footage was taken at Statesville Correctional Center in 1988 and appeared to show Richard Speck imbibing in drugs and alcohol, performing lewd acts on other inmates and sporting a pair of breasts he had grown through taking smuggled hormones. At one point in the video, Speck tells the camera, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." He was also far from repentant for his evil acts. During the video, he admits to the murders, stating he had no feelings and felt no remorse. After the trial, Corazon Amorao returned to the Philippines and started a family before eventually returning to the US, where she continued to pursue her career in the medical field, eventually retiring at the age of 68. She is a pillar of strength, but has no interest in the spotlight and rarely speaks publicly about the event. Her friends and family speak in her absence and state that while she still occasionally has nightmares about the horrific killings, she feels that she was spared by God and is determined to live her life to the fullest in honor of the friends she lost on that fateful night in 1966. Our final story is that of a man who made crime his career. Henry Starr came from a long line of infamous outlaws. Born on December 2nd, 1873, his grandfather, Tom, was a criminal who rustled stock and ran whiskey into Indian territory. His grandson later said he was known far and wide as the devil's own. In all matters where law and order were on one side, he was on the other. Henry's uncle, Sam Starr, was also known for his marriage to the queen of the Oklahoma outlaws, Belle Starr. Despite this colourful lineage, Henry's parents, George and Mary Starr, were honest workers who raised him and his two siblings on a sprawling farm. Both of them had Cherokee blood, and so all the Starr children grew up in Indian Territory, an area that now encompasses the present states of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Iowa. Henry's idyllic childhood ended in 1886 with the untimely death of his father, George. Just a few months later, his mother married a man named C.N. Walker. His relationship with Walker was utterly different from the one he had shared with his biological father. He despised him, Walker was abusive, and Henry also believed him to be inferior due to him having no Indian blood in his veins. Only a few months after the marriage and the death of his father, Starr left the family home. By age 16, he had found work as a cowboy on a ranch near Nowata, a town in Indian Territory located a few miles south of present-day Kansas. During his time there, he had his first run-in with the law. Two deputies stopped the boy as he was driving a wagon into town. When they searched inside, they discovered bottles of whiskey. At the time, alcohol was prohibited on Indian lands, and so Starr found himself charged with introducing spirits into the territory. Having borrowed the wagon, he told them he had no idea that the whiskey was there. Though he would eventually plead guilty, he maintained that he was, in fact, innocent. Henry's next alleged criminal offence was more serious. In December 1891, he was charged with stealing a horse and sent to jail at Fort Smith in Arkansas. Again, he maintained his innocence, but the authorities didn't believe him. One of his cousins ultimately paid his bail, allowing him to walk free while awaiting trial, but he never showed up in court. The judge immediately put out an arrest warrant for him, giving it to Deputy Marshal Henry Dickey and Floyd Wilson, both of whom would spend the next few years chasing him down. Having been unjustly punished twice on charges that he was innocent of, Henry decided that if the world wanted to see him as a criminal, then that's what he would become. With this, he formed a gang with fellow outlaws Ed Newcomb and Jesse Jackson. Together, they blazed a trail across Indian Territory, robbing businesses as they went. Their first target was the Nowata Railroad Depot, which was followed by Schufelt's store in the town of Lenape and Carter's store in Sequoia. By the end of 1892, the trio had made off with more than $2,000, the equivalent of about $67,000 in today's money. The gang were brazen, with most of their raids taking place in broad daylight. After a hit, they would retreat to the Osage Hills north of Tulsa to hide out and divvy up their loot. It's claimed that after robbing a train in August of 1892, a passenger on board named Mary Smith ran off with the gang, spending several days with them before returning home. A few months later, she would become Starr's first wife. Henry's luck nearly ran out in December of that year when Deputy Marshals Dickey and Wilson caught up to him while he was at a ranch near Nowata. Both deputy marshals pursued Henry to an opening in the nearby Wolf Creek, but because Dickey's horse had been unsaddled when Wilson set off, he was a few minutes behind his partner. And so it was Wilson who finally caught up to Henry and ordered him to surrender. When he failed to do so, a warning shot was fired over his head, which drove Henry to return fire. The ensuing gunfight between the two was brutal. According to the website Legends of America, quote, Wilson was hit and fell to the ground, badly wounded. When he tried to load a fresh cartridge into his rifle, the weapon jammed and he threw it aside, reaching for his pistol. Starr fired 2 more shots and Wilson sank to the ground, too weak to defend himself. Then, calmly walking over to Wilson, Starr fired 1 more round into his heart. End quote. By the time Deputy Marshal Dickey arrived, the gunfight was long over and his partner was dead. Henry, on the other hand, had managed to flee the scene, using Wilson's horse after the gunfight had caused his to run away. Because of this incident, the arrest warrant for Henry was amended to include murder, and efforts to capture the Marshal Slayer was stepped up. A reward of $5,000 was also offered for his capture. This led to another gunfight with lawmen in January of 1893, after they managed to track Starr down to a house in Bartlesville. A witness claimed that some 200 shots were fired, resulting in gang member Jesse Jackson being shot and captured. Newcomb and Starr, however, managed to escape. This close call did nothing to deter Henry. In fact, he likely enjoyed it. He would later state, when asked about the outlaw life, "I love it. It is wild with adventure." For his next raids, Starr would team up with an outlaw named Frank Cheney, and after hitting several more railway depots and stores, they set their sights on a bigger target. On March the 28th, 1893, the two outlaws set about plundering the Caney Valley National Bank. They entered it with their Colt revolvers drawn, locked the customers and employees in a back room, and made off with nearly $5,000. Despite an altercation with one cashier, things couldn't have gone much smoother, and this success only served to spur them on. Less than 2 months later, Henry and Cheney would strike again. This time, they robbed a passenger train at Pryor Creek and relieved its passengers of some $6,000. Their next target was the People's National Bank of Bentonville in Arkansas, which they planned to hit on June the 5th, 1893. By this point, tales of Henry Starr and his gang's daring robberies and gunfights with lawmen filled newspapers, and so when he rode into town, he was instantly recognized and the alarm was raised. Despite this, Starr and Cheney still managed to make off with $11,000, nearly $500,000 in today's money, which they split between themselves and 3 other outlaws they had recruited. With the heat on them ratcheting up, the gang decided to go their separate ways until things cooled down. Henry planned to head to California, and during his journey, he decided to stop off in Colorado Springs. This decision would prove fateful. When he tried to check into the Spaulding House Hotel using a fake name, he was instantly recognized, and staff alerted lawmen who were able to arrest the felon while he was having lunch. With this, Starr was quickly transferred to Fort Smith in Arkansas. The courts there initially decided that he should hang for the murder of Deputy Marshal Wilson. However, his lawyers appealed and were able to secure another trial, but he was once again sentenced to hang. Following a second appeal and a third trial on January the 15th, 1898, Starr was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In jail, Henry was said to be well behaved and found notoriety after he successfully disarmed a fellow prisoner, the outlaw Crawford Goldsberry, better known as Cherokee Bill. In 1901, his family and the Cherokee tribal government used this incident to apply for a presidential pardon. Theodore Roosevelt was reportedly so impressed by Henry's courage that he agreed to reduce his punishment. 2 years later, on January the 16th, 1903, Henry walked away from Fort Smith as a free man. It initially seemed as if Henry's stint in jail had convinced him that it was time to lead an honest life. He settled down in Tulsa, working at his mother's restaurant, and eventually married a local woman named Ollie Griffin. In 1904, they welcomed a son, whom they named Theodore Roosevelt Starr. Unfortunately for Henry, the authorities in Arkansas, having learned of his release, petitioned for him to be extradited for the Bentonville robbery in 1893. Realizing that he would never be completely free from his criminal past, Henry fled back to his hideout in the Osage Hills and fell back into his old ways. By 1908, he was back to robbing banks. In May of that year, the authorities once again caught up with Henry after an acquaintance tipped him off to his whereabouts. Again on trial, Henry pleaded guilty to a robbery in Amity and was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. Despite not receiving much of a formal education, Starr was an intelligent man, and while incarcerated, he perhaps surprisingly studied law and wrote his autobiography. 5 years after being imprisoned, he would be paroled due to his good behavior, though the court stipulated that he wasn't to leave Colorado. He not only broke this rule almost immediately, but also set about his most prolific and profitable series of bank robberies. In total, he hit 14 banks in Oklahoma, making off with more than $25,000. He became so infamous and widely feared that the state legislature passed the bank robber bill, which offered $15,000 for the capture of any bank robber, with Starr also having a $1,000 bounty placed on his head, payable dead or alive. On March the 27th, 1915, Henry, along with 6 other outlaws that he had recruited, rode into Stroud, Oklahoma, hoping to hit 2 of its banks simultaneously. However, news of their arrival quickly spread, and the townspeople took up arms against them. And while most of the gang made it away successfully, a teenager managed to fire a shot at Henry, seriously injuring him and preventing him from escaping. On August the 2nd, 1915, Henry Starr pled guilty to the double bank robbery at Stroud and was sentenced to 25 years at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. While in prison, Henry was interviewed by a reporter from a local newspaper. During it, he showed remorse for the robberies he had committed and urged young people to find honest work. He said, quote, "I'm 45 years old now, and 17 of my 45 years have been spent inside. Isn't that enough to tell any boy that there's nothing to the kind of life I have led?" End quote. Convinced by his good behavior and passionate statements, the authorities decided to release him on parole in 1919. Once again a free man, he decided to use his notoriety for good by producing and starring in a silent film called A Debtor to the Law. The movie depicts the Stroud Bank heists featuring some of those present on the day of the event, even the boy who had shot Henry, and has a strong anti-crime message. Starr stated he saw it as a way to exercise his criminal past and confess his crimes. It proved to be a big success and led to Henry starring in several other films and even getting offers from Hollywood. However, he turned these down, believing that setting foot in California would result in him being extradited to Arkansas to stand trial for the Bentonville robbery. A year after his release from the Colorado prison, Henry married again, this time to a 23-year-old woman named Hulda. They moved to Claremore, Oklahoma, where Henry lived a quiet and peaceful life for a short time. Despite his words and actions to the contrary, it seemed that Henry Starr loved the thrill of bank robbing too much to simply live a normal life and fade away from the public eye. He needed one more high, one more payday. And so on the morning of February the 18th, 1921, he and 3 other outlaws traveled to Harrison, Arkansas, to rob the People's State Bank. The timeline of Starr's crime wave was so broad that while he sidled up to his first job on horseback, this one he pulled up to in an automobile. Some claim becoming the first bank robber to use a getaway car. All seemed to be going to plan, and it looked as though the gang would make off with $6,000. But before they could all get away, the former bank president, William Myers, fetched an emergency firearm stashed in the vault and opened fire. One shot hit Henry Starr in his spine. Henry's accomplices managed to escape from Harrison, but he was less lucky. He was rushed to the county jail where the doctor was able to remove the bullet, but the wound was mortal. The next morning, February 22nd, 1921, Henry Starr passed away with his wife, mother, and 17-year-old son by his side. For many, the violence surrounding Henry Starr's death was a fitting end for someone who had lived most of his life breaking the law. But while he was a criminal, Henry did remain true to the unspoken code among outlaws, and to some, he was seen as a social bandit, a rebel acting against those in charge, almost akin to Robin Hood. Whatever your view of his life is, I think we can all agree that it has left us with a story worth telling. Before he died, Henry Starr is said to have bragged to the doctor that he had robbed more banks than any man in America. And much of the money and gold that he made off with has never been found. It's claimed that much of it is hidden near the Cimarron River in Stevens County, Kansas, in a spot described as near the border, in a place nobody could find in 1,000,000 years. So, if you ever find yourself in southwest Kansas, be sure to keep your eyes peeled. Thank you for watching. More new episodes are on the way, but I know these longer compilations also have their fans. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.